It's actually, and obviously, you know, one of the funny things about art, I mean, I don't get it. I'm obviously showing that I really don't get it. I mean, I barely even got like the Sistine Chapel when I went there. I'm that much of an ignoramus. It's like, yeah, well, I was pointing at someone, big deal. But some people do, and some people are prepared to pay a lot of money. And there's a sort of, I think there's a thing that transcends art, and it's just a collector mentality.
The Sistine Chapel's a lot better than that.
I know. That's a
Scott is emotionally challenged.
For anyone watching, I mean, what's that?
Scott's just likened the Sistine Chapel to like a scribble on a bit of paper.
Scribble. It looks like a 3-year-old drawing a sunrise or something. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. The weather's been a bit mental this week, hasn't it? We had a couple of nice weeks, and then was it yesterday? Yesterday it was like sunny, and then a blizzard, and then sunny.
And then it was snowing this morning when I was hanging the washing out.
Yeah, It was a bit weird. So that's England for you. I wonder what it might be like. We're lucky enough to have a guest this week, and our guest is presumably, when you were younger, used to better weather than this, because you come from Uruguay and you lived in Barcelona for a while. They didn't have any of this kind of nonsense, did they?
No, really.
So this is Maria Lemmer, and she is a founder of a company, a startup called Weaver Labs, about which we'll hear more in a sec. So thanks a lot for coming, Maria. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
I first encountered Maria by her PR agency pitching a couple of byline pieces, and the most recent one you wrote about, you sort of, I know your background, which we'll get into in greater detail in a sec, is more on the network side of it, but you were also talking about things like sort of blockchain and sort of decentralized and Web3 and all these very buzzy words, and I sort of thought, and I said to Ian, this is who we're having on, and this is some of the stuff she might be talking about, and he's like, oh shit. I don't know anything about any of that. In fact, I might make a habit of that, just exposing you.
I said I could just drink beer instead.
You could just drink beer. But I don't know anything about it either, and so I welcome it, that we'll talk about something a little bit different. So I think we'll talk about that. It looks like I've kept the preamble to a minimum. Normally I just bang on and talk shit for about 10 minutes, but I've sort of got to the point. You've helped me focus my mind, Maria.
Good.
I think we're going to talk about, Ian's written some really interesting pieces. Sort of the last couple of weeks we've chatted about the sanctions that most recently have come about from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But let's not forget, like, the US already was quite into sanctions before that. It's like it was already getting warmed up, and then when this kicked off in one world, we're just more of that then. And you wrote a piece about how, despite the sanctions, Huawei seems to be buying more stuff than ever off US
Well, China,
companies.
Really.
China.
Yeah,
oh, okay, right. Yeah. I should familiarise myself with your pieces better before I flag them up, but there we go. So we can talk about that, and let me see if I've been organised and actually got your pieces up. And then you also wrote another. Yeah, you're right. That was China. Thanks for correcting me. And then you're also talking. This is again a sort of follow up of some of the stuff we've spoken about, I think, last week, of how difficult it is for companies, even if they're trying to play ball and do all the sanction bit. It's not as simple as that. You can't just flick off the switch. And you specifically wrote about Nokia, so I'll ask you about that. And I think the broader issue there is just sort of. What does all this stuff say about the nature of globalization, how it is now, what direction it's headed in, and how that affects us? And then I think we might, maybe I said Huawei because I was thinking about another thing that I wrote at the start of the week, and I think you covered it too. They came out with their annual report where they made much less money than they have for ages, but they somehow made loads more profit than they have for ages. And we both thought, how's that then? And so I had a little look into it, and actually a prompting from you, credit where it's due, but then I did go and do some of my own work, which consisted of taking screenshots from their annual report. Anyway, and we'll look into that and maybe speculate about what this says about what Huawei's up to.
It's interesting what they sort of trousered from their asset sales as well.
Yeah.
Because that figure hadn't come out before, and
well,
I don't think other people referred to it even. The mainstream,
and they basically flogged their stuff to the Chinese state. So
the Chinese state basically gave them $9 billion. It seems.
There you go. They spend it all at once, sweet cheeks. Go and buy yourself something nice. So yes, so that's that. So yes, and by the way, Pierre, from now on, I've got to try and remember, as I said on IM, to also do a call to action about our newsletter, because people in our marketing department have asked me to do it. So as well as doing all the, if you're watching it, then you can listen to it, I'm going to do that. So you've got to remind me of that each week and throw things at my head if I don't do it.
Go ahead.
So if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can also listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. And if you're so entranced by this conversation that you want to be in regular contact with Telecoms.com, then make sure you go onto the site and subscribe to our newsletter, because that will get my marketing people off my back. So there we go. Don't worry, they don't watch this. Right, well, let's get straight into introducing Maria properly. So why don't we start by you telling us what Weaver Labs is and what the point of it is, and we might work backwards into what got you there and some of the technology surrounding it from there.
Definitely. Weaver Labs is way more interesting than me, so
right.
We can talk about it.
Aren't you one and the same thing?
No, not really. Weaver Labs is a software startup working on the telecoms industry. And like most of these companies like to call themselves, like, I'm a blockchain startup.
Right.
We are a telecoms company.
Okay.
And we sit on the management and orchestration layer. We build a software that it's called CellStack. And essentially at the back of it, it's an orchestrator. It aggregates telecoms infrastructure, it controls it, it creates network services across a variety of pieces of infrastructure, and it opens it up to be consumed as a service, very simply and in a way that the consumer doesn't really have to
consume
think
what
about
as a service? The network
services.
itself?
Telecom services, yes.
Right, okay.
The network itself. So the idea is to bring CellStack into an open marketplace of telecoms assets. So because we can manage and orchestrate one network in one domain, can we not just bring other domains? Can we not mix infrastructures that belong to different people and different companies and create network services across these multiple domains? And if we have 2, 3, 5 of those in a city, what we have is it's an open marketplace of assets. Yeah,
so I'm picturing just like a pure marketplace of network services where, let's say you're an ISP or you're a company that wants to create a private network or something like that. You could just, in theory, go shopping, like if you're going on the Tesco's website or something like that, and just go, yeah, I'll have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and your technology would be one of the things that might enable something like that. I know that's a massive dumbing down of what you've probably spent years of your life devoted to doing, but I'm trying to put it in Scott language.
Yeah, no, and that's
am I barking
exactly
up the right
it.
Tree?
No, it is exactly it. So if we think about how AWS actually made it possible for people like you and I create cloud services from our home, upload it to AWS, and then there is a marketplace of cloud applications, right? I have a friend who does that for a living, right? So the same is for network services. We have companies that build networks, actually go onto the streets and build networks. We have companies that create applications that can be, can enhance network services. And now with Open RAN and all these XR apps and all these software pieces, networks are actually evolving into these software platforms. So our software, what it does, it aggregates all of that, communicates also with the infrastructure layer, and offers it to whoever wants to consume it.
So the first thing that occurs to me is the telecoms world is traditionally quite closed. Mm-hmm. You've got traditionally a small number of major vendors, Ericsson, Nokia, and until the Yanks decided they weren't happy with them, Huawei were the big three. And then, of course, you've got a very high barrier to entry to be a mobile network operator, which is one of the reasons they're so heavily regulated. And presumably they, it's certainly traditionally from a consumer point of view, their model has always been to try and sort of not entrap, but they want stickiness. They want customers to sign up for like a 2-year post-paid deal. And so I can't imagine them being too keen about being part of a marketplace such as you're trying to develop that would allow for this really fluid chopping and changing. Is that one of the things you're trying to overcome? And do you get a lot of sort of pushback from the incumbents, from the traditional industry in what you're trying to do?
So to the first point that you're making, in terms of the industry being closed, 100% right. It is something that we experienced working at the beginning of this journey. It was difficult to get access to, the actual vendor equipment, but that is changing with the industry push, with open API, softwareization of networks, and we are seeing more and more integration happening at a software layer. So it's not something that we are pushing to change. It's something industry is changing, right?
So that's the stuff that's been going on for a while. Not so much necessarily Open RAN, but the sort of NFV, sort of virtualization, cloudification, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, we're moving towards more like IT type of infrastructure. We're moving into microservice architectures where things are enclosed in little pieces of software and talk to other little pieces of software through APIs. And that is exactly what Open RAN is about, but other pieces as well, right? Orchestration is that as well.
Yeah.
And we are trying to think about telecom systems as something that it's software coming together and talking to each other. So the industry is already moving towards that. And then the incumbents in terms of the mobile network operators, and if they would be willing to be part of something like this, it should be transparent for them. Realistically, we have still an infrastructure investment question to answer. Who's going to pay for all of these small cells that need to be deployed? And we have a variety of new investors coming into the picture, right? We have neutral hosts, we have specialized network providers, we have even public sector now investing in telecoms infrastructure. So the idea is that all of this infrastructure is going to exist, but you and I need to make an agreement that we can access it. Then I need to make an agreement with him that I can access it. Whereas what we are saying is, instead of making all these bilateral agreements, let's create a system where it can be made transparently for you.
And totally open, as you say, rather than dependent on individual sort of micro agreements between people. I've got some other stuff, but I haven't given you a chance to ask any questions.
No, I was just going to, who would you see as a sort of, because it's an orchestrator, I guess, your core sort of offering. Who would you see as the main kind of rivals in that market? Is there an opportunity to disrupt big players that are pushing those sorts of products at the moment, or is it very much stuff that Ericsson and Nokia would do themselves, that where you're kind of coming in? And
I think we're coming in from a perspective more like the Rakuten school of thought, of mix and match, of
because orchestrate is one of those things. It's my own ignorance, but I always struggle to understand exactly where this sits in the network and exactly what it does. Are you sort of on the BOSS side of things more, would you say, or does it fall under that category, sort of IT back office management stuff?
Yes.
Or, you're not actually building base stations, are you? And you're not developing radio software.
No.
So I'm just trying to get my head around where your sort of offering fits and what exactly it does in the network, really.
So if we start from the beginning, right? We have a core network, a radio access network, and those are pieces of software that are running in hardware, right? And now these pieces of software that are running in hardware exist within a cloud environment. Let's assume that's the case. For the radio access network, it's not the case yet, but it can be the case. So there are certain interfaces that are exposed and that can control that infrastructure and also the services. So the orchestration is the layer that does that. So sits in the management layer of that network. So I can reserve CPU, memory. I can create slices, the real slices, not the ones that we all talk about but never happen.
The network slices. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. No, the resources, I can actually assign quotas of resources.
This is the old school cloud.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because we are not reinventing anything here. We're just applying concepts that have been around for many, many years, right? It's just that instead of orchestrating containers that are running applications on the application layer, our application now is 5G software. That's it. And that's precisely what we do. So CellStack at the very base layer has an infrastructure manager that talks to the infrastructure with a set of plugins. So you can talk OpenStack, you can talk Metal as a service.
CellStack is a product of yours?
Yes, it's
right,
our stack, yeah.
Right.
And then on top, it has a service layer, right? It creates all this network chain and services that allows you to communicate from A to B. And then on top, it has an application layer that essentially you can manage that infrastructure with a nice UI.
So in today's world, it's just all a lot more static, basically, and it's harder to do that sort of thing, to spin up a network, say in a particular area, and assign it very, very kind of granular resources at that level. Wouldn't be something that you could easily do in kind of the traditional setting.
It is something that we have been trying to achieve with different levels of collaboration in the industry. So there is, for example, Open Source Mano, who's being championed and by the Etsy community. There is this community called Onap that I don't know whatever happened to them. I think they all went to work on the Telecom Infra project Open RAN environment. I don't know what happened, but it was actually trying to deal with this, right?
Yep.
How can we build platforms, software platforms that can actually make networks more programmable and be automated.
It's interesting you mentioned ONAP, because I remember a few years ago it was one of the things I was trying to write about, probably not that well, and we had a in-house staff just covering that really, and then all of a sudden it's you don't really hear or see anything about it now. But it was heavily backed by AT&T, as I remember, and Orange was on board, and it's kind of interesting you say.
Throw in the towel and decide it couldn't be bothered with that sort of thing anymore.
I don't know. I mean, I'm curious now. It's interesting that you say nothing's really happened with it, because does that in itself sort of create an opportunity for people like you to come along and do something? The
Definitely.
fact that hasn't really gone anywhere. I mean, what do you think was the problem with ONAP? Because I did hear some people saying it was millions of lines of code, wasn't it? Apparently, and people were saying you needed such big in-house teams to manage it that.
The architecture was overcomplicated from our perspective when we were looking at it. At that time, we were working with Open Source Mano. The architecture was super complicated. But I think what happened was what often happens with the telecoms industry is that we never get to work together. We want to, and all the good intentions are there, but it is very difficult.
Who's we?
The telecoms industry.
The various components of it.
Exactly, right? We all, from even the radio manufacturers all the way down to the software manufacturers, everyone contributing, we want to work together and solve the problems, because we understand that that's how we do it. Yeah. But then it becomes very difficult because, of course, like you need to open up your APIs and I need to be able to see what's flying around.
And everyone's a bit precious about their little silo. In fact, that does, if that's all right, Ian, if you don't mind me going off on a little bit of a tangent. So your background immediately before doing this is you were working at King's College, London. And that immediately rang a bell, because a few years ago, I used to be in touch with someone I know is a former colleague of yours, Misha Dola. Mm-hmm. And I wrote from Mobile World Congress, I wrote this very sceptical thing about 5G being overhyped, and used a use case that he set up, although I found out subsequently you set it up, about robotic surgery. So when I was taking the piss out of robotic surgery, I was basically taking the piss out of what Maria was up to. You know what I mean? So it's slightly awkward, but we've got past it. But actually the reason I bring it up isn't to sort of rehash that, because sort of Misha got in touch on LinkedIn and was like, what the fuck? And then I went to his bit on the Ericsson stand and wrote another story, just going, okay, It
was cool though.
Yeah, it was cool. I mean, if you've listened to the pod, you'll know where we're coming from. It's just when we're just naturally sceptical about what appear to be utopian use cases. Mm-hmm. Now, if and a lot of it is how people present them and how they market them. If they're just presented as this is a thing you could do, and I'm not saying next time you get a doctor, some Medibot 5000 is going to start running at you with a scalpel. Exactly, like something out of Total Recall or something like that. But this is an illustration of what it's like when you've got increased bandwidth and low latency, and et cetera, then that's fine. And it's part of our job as journalists, or at least this is what I've decided. Part of my job as a journalist is to take the piss out of these things a little bit anyway. But the reason I bring it up is you were talking about everyone sort of working with each other, and presumably when you're in a sort of commercially neutral environment like you were at King's College, did that not make this bringing together various stakeholders to try and achieve the sort of grand vision, did that not make it a bit easier when you're in that role?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. That was the beauty of the lab, right? The 5G tactile internet lab that Ericsson sponsored. I believe that's why we were so successful in bringing together all these different pieces. We did not only do the Internet of Skills demo with the robotic surgery. We did a concert from
that's it
with
him and his daughter, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And we brought the 5G network all the way down to the Guildhall.
So he's a really good pianist, isn't he?
He is, yeah.
Just annoying, isn't it? Really clever and a really good pianist.
And his daughter sings beautifully,
Yeah.
So it was actually something very emotive, and we showed how that was possible. But all of this came out of conversations we were having with professionals in the space. It's not us, telecoms industry, sitting together and saying, what can we do with this? This was actually coming from the industry. We went together. I remember when I started working at the lab that we had to go to talk to the industries, and we were asking them what keeps you awake at night in your business that technology can do and solve this problem, right? And the Internet of Skills came about because Prakhar Dasgupta, who's the surgeon who was actually sponsoring this demo, he said, I hate I've lost my sense of touch when operating with a robot, even if that means in the same room. Even in laparoscopic.
So you're talking about like haptic feedback and that sort of thing. Yeah.
And that's how we started doing haptic feedback and understanding how we could transmit that sense of touch over the internet. It doesn't mean that 5G is going to solve that problem. It means that technology in general, because it is a combination, right? We had robotics department working with us, the sensors that were developed to capture that haptic feedback. All the AV people, working on stitching 360 video real time, and software that could bring together all of these systems. Telecoms was just a tiny component.
But it links it all up.
It links it all up, and it gives the argument to it.
The other podcast I listened to you're on, you made that point, because I rarely, for me, actually did a bit of preparation and research before Maria coming on, because I haven't met her before, so I thought I'd put a bit of effort in. And I listened to a podcast you did, but it was, and we'll get onto this in a sec, it was more coming from the sort of blockchain, metaverse, Web3 kind of direction. And so the chap interviewing you is a VC who knows a lot about his area, but not that much about telecoms. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because everything we do, obviously, is from the telecoms perspective. And it was just interesting hearing it from that point of view. But, we'll get onto the metaverse in a sec. But, you can see where things go. Like, back to your robotic surgery thing, you can imagine a real utility where, let's say, someone is using augmented reality, or they are using robotic tools, or they're just using a tool that's connected that has sensors on it. I don't know, I can imagine. Obviously I've never done any surgery. It's not something you just dabble in, is it? Just give it a go on a Friday night.
Exactly. Like me connecting cables on a Friday night.
But I can imagine if you had like a scalpel or something that also had sensors that tell you sort of temperature or chemical balance or something like that, and then you're constantly getting this information. To a skilled surgeon, there might be some extra layers of information that could help them to be even better at putting people back together than they already are. So
hopefully.
So yeah, but no, the reason I mentioned that pod is because one of the things you said initially to this chap, is just to point out, he's like, we don't really talk about networks that much, and you said, well, it's kind of what stitches everything together. And wireless, if you could see this studio, you'd see the appeal of wireless. Because this place is a health and safety disaster waiting to happen. The amount of wires there are to trip over. And that's only since Pierre got a longer HDMI cable. Before that, you used to have to do a limbo dance, which anyone who knows me would know that's an unlikely manoeuvre. So obviously wireless just frees you up. But if you're doing something mission critical, like the surgery or whatever, it's got to be incredibly robust.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where some of the things come in. Anyway, I sort of banged on a little bit there, but back to your day job. Before I move on to some of the tangents that I just sort of explored a minute ago, could you perhaps summarise why? So you're a startup, so you might not be familiar to a lot of people listening. Could you just sort of summarise, why it is that the area of that you work in is something that people, in a broader sense, should be interested in, and where you see your area of professional concerns sort of heading in the next few years?
I mean, at the end of the day, we are just trying to solve a problem that it's on the commercial side of the telecoms. It's not a problem that lies on the technology itself. We use technology to solve a commercial problem. And the commercial problem is like, how are we going to get all of this infrastructure that needs to be in place to create all of these cool applications that we talk about, right? And that's the reason why I think for us it's so easy to talk about CellStack and the open marketplace and what we build, because it naturally comes together of saying, oh, at the end of the day, the only thing you're doing is you're just knitting together things that exist in silos. And that's essentially what the telecoms industry is, right? Things that exist in silos. Yeah. And that's why I think people should care about and think about it as a viable way to solve the shortcomings of infrastructure investment.
And do you think these are viewed as pain points more broadly? Obviously, you've identified a business opportunity, or you wouldn't have created this startup or been involved in this startup. But do you sense that the broad industry is thinking we could do with a bit more of what these people are doing?
Yes, I think so. Because when we talk about network as a service, I'm also a big supporter of hating buzzwords.
Yeah, we'll get onto that. There's plenty of time for that.
It's just sometimes you just have to use them because there is not a better term.
And anyway, as a service says ass, which is funny. So
yeah, exactly.
I approve of that one.
Yeah, good. At the end of the day, we want connectivity to be consumed easily, right? Because then more of it can be consumed. So when we talk to neutral host providers, or even, public sector investing in telecoms infrastructure, or even MNOs, solving their headaches of, I need extra capacity in this area, but I don't have any justification to go and invest on a small cell deployment. And this technology allows to alleviate these problems. First of all, the demand can find the access to whatever is deployed in there. And the supply can be offered and can be shown somewhere to be found.
Yeah.
Because sometimes one of the biggest headaches you have when deploying a network is to find the assets that exist in there.
Right.
Where is the fiber? You have to go and talk one by one to all of the providers and ask them if they have if they have fiber in your area.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, what you're describing in some ways is just kind of the revelation sort of 20 years ago about the internet, because what the internet really did, apart from what some people use it for, which I won't go into now, but it really just created these marketplaces. Take something like Amazon, where previously if I wanted to get something I'd have to go down the shops, and that'd be a bit more hassle and a bit more time used up. Now I can just fire up Amazon in 5 minutes, the thing will turn up tomorrow. And so it was just these electronic, incredibly dynamic, incredibly well-populated marketplaces. And we think one we always talk about as a sort of use case for the sort of 4G mobile internet is something like Uber. All Uber really is a labour marketplace, isn't it?
Yeah.
For people who've got a car and fuck all to do.
Well,
so they'll drive you around
in central London in the middle of the day.
Yeah. So it sounds like, again, putting it into simple Scott words of one syllable, you're trying to apply that same sort of open, frictionless marketplace logic to the procurement of telecom services. Mm-hmm. Is that right? And
the integration of whatever combines a network, right? So
right, the bits and bobs.
The bits, exactly.
Yeah, again, in my language.
But it is exactly
I'm just aware
that, right?
I'm talking to someone who's forgotten about more of this stuff than I'll ever know. But we're going to have to stick with bits and bobs because that's all I can understand. Go ahead, mate.
I was just going to ask on the sort of neutral
Do you want a beer, by the way, Maria?
I'm okay, thank you.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Sure.
She's got to go and do some networking after. And that's not schmoozing, that's actual networking.
No, I was just going to ask on the sort of neutral host, because neutral hosts becoming a bigger thing, I think, now, with especially with some of these tower companies, I suppose, as well, companies like CellStack, and there was another one last week doing a deal. I can't remember who it was. But
an American one.
Yeah.
American smug tower company.
But are you sort of, I mean, is your company kind of involved to some extent in, there's an opportunity there with all this infrastructure, I guess, and with, ducts and poles being made more open by regulation for potentially Open RAN companies to come along on the sort of tower side and make use of some of these assets. And, is part of what you're doing trying to help that all kind of stitch together? I mean, that in itself doesn't sound like a sort of software orchestrated job. It's more of a kind of going out there and playing a kind of, more physical role, I guess, in terms of banging heads together. But is that sort of partly what you're trying to do? And and it's not just, I mean, it's also the spectrum side of it, I suppose, with Ofcom sort of changing rules on allowing you to buy spectrum now and use it in a specific area. I think Germany's done the same thing, hasn't it, where they've carved out spectrum for kind of industrial use. And the whole market, I mean, people are talking a lot about private 5G, and the whole market seems to be in flux, I guess.
Yeah.
Whether it'll go anywhere, I don't know, but there's certainly a kind of lot of things happening where you could potentially see some new entrants coming along and thriving, and I'm guessing those are some of the players that you would want to work with, perhaps more than a big traditional operator that's always going to kind of carry on doing things the same way anyway. But
Yeah. So, for example, with the case of CellStack, right? So we recently won one of the Frank projects with them, working with CellStack, University of Bristol, Satellite Catapults, and Atocore. And Parallel Wireless joined us after as an Open RAN vendor. And one of the use cases that we are going to demonstrate as part of this project, it's the integration of public and private networks. Of course, CellStack owns private networks, but would like to integrate with public MNOs, because the public MNO would want to use the infrastructure as a service. So, of course, CellStack would definitely be a user of CellStack in a way to integrate these networks. And they're coming from the perspective of, I'm doing all of this investment in telecoms infrastructure for these private networks, but I can just sell off a bit of capacity and be used for public usage for the MNOs. And that's exactly the other thing we're doing in Manchester with the Smart Junctions project. So the Smart Junctions sensor, and this is now coming to the reality of what 5G is providing, right? 5G, private networks, it is being deployed because we have spectrum. Yeah. Most of the use cases that we are deploying do not really need 5G.
I'm going to ask her about the new radio thing, whether it's any faster. Sorry, just a reminder. Carry on. But just mental note.
We are deploying a corridor, so a 1.5 kilometer in Salford, because it is cheaper to deploy a 5G private network than it is to wire all the sensors up. Right? And then you can just use the excess of capacity for other use cases. And it brings a new business model for a public sector organization such as Transport for Greater Manchester to invest in telecoms infrastructure and create a sustainability plan, because it's not revenue, right? Public sector cannot make money out of it, but they can make sustainable income out of this, the excess of capacity. So there is a large change in the market of who's coming in, leveraging the private network concept. But at the end of the day, why do we call it private network? Because it just has a spectrum that we call it private network because of that. But it's the same technology, it's the same principle. And we just leverage on that.
Well, that does provide a good segue, because we were chatting a little bit before we started recording, and it's relevant to the thing I mentioned with your project with Ericsson and Misha. The thing that makes me skeptical is when I think stuff's being overhyped. And by overhyped, I mean you can hype something all you want, but then you've got to be able to back it up with delivery and reality. And it wasn't that I thought that what you and Misha and Ericsson were demoing by itself was overhyped. I just considered it symptomatic of a broader overhyping of 5G at the time. But where we are now with 5G, I think I was just mentioning to you, I had to get a cab here because I'd done my ankle in. So I normally walk to the station, but I got a cab. Well, not here. I got a cab to Hitchin Station, and a cabbie was on top form. He was just flying into it. He was like, what are you going to London for? I went, I'll do a podcast. So what about telecoms? And he went, when do we get 5G then? And just started giving it all that about 5G. It was quite funny. It's actually really valuable just to hear about it from man in the street.
As long as you didn't say that 5G, that's what causes coronavirus, isn't it?
He didn't. No, he didn't go there.
By the way.
Yeah. No, he didn't go there. I miss those days.
I cover this. I know.
Yeah, those are some of the easiest reads we ever got when people started conflating 5G and Rona.
I had to give a talk about it.
Did you?
Yeah.
Right, and
really?
Explain why you can't transmit viruses over electromagnetic
explain
radiation.
how if 4G did not create any deadly virus, why 5G had to do it.
But that's the thing. People don't know what 5G is. They think, and this leads up to the question I just reminded myself to ask you. They think 5G is a completely new thing.
Yeah, which is the same thing. I'm just like, if you speak Spanish or you speak French, is it going to? You can kill someone just because you change languages. Same is for us, Yeah. 4G and 5G are just different languages.
I don't know how you say G. Is it G? How do you say G in Spanish?
G.
Yeah, it's G. So 5G. 5G. What is it in French?
G.
5G. 5G and 5G are all the same. I've run out of languages. You don't know what it is in Slovakian, do you?
Cinque.
Not off the top of my head, no.
Cinque. Anyway. But yeah, obviously it was a mercifully short cab ride, so I didn't have to get too into it. But there is this problem of overhyping both within the industry, which is generally how we approach it, but then to some extent to consumers, because this cabbie didn't let me get a word in edgeways. He was on a roll, but if I had, I would have just gone. I wouldn't worry about it, mate. It's not going to make any difference to your life. As long as you got 4G, you're good to go. But this is an issue we have in terms of the hyping, and I think I always put the blame largely at the feet not of people actually doing stuff like you, but the marketing people who are obviously under pressure. The thing about a new generation of technology is it's an opportunity to create a hype cycle, to create an upgrade cycle in terms of devices, in terms of new subscriptions and all that sort of thing. But now we're getting into all sorts of other areas, which I want to chat to you about, because I presume one of the things that underpins the kind of decentralized marketplace kind of stuff that you're doing now is quite buzzwordy concepts like sort of blockchain. And then from blockchain, we get into other buzzwords like NFTs, metaverse, Web3, and the most recent byline that we published that was written by you on Telecoms.com sort of touches on those things. So I thought we'd just have a little bit of a jargon busting stroke. How much of a shit should we give about these buzzwords type of phase. So I think we've done 5G. I don't think we need to do that. Would you mind just giving us, because Ian and I were talking about this, and we're both feeling a bit ignorant. Would you mind give us just your perception of what? Not so much what blockchain is, you don't need to get into the minutiae of the mechanics of it, but why people should care about it, what its utility is.
Sure. So, just one comment on the buzzwords.
Yeah. Please do. No, go for it.
I think they're necessary to create the necessary hype in the industry to get people interested and working on something and flow the money in there, right? We need the investment for us to start working on something. Then once we get our hands dirty, we need to stop.
And you've got to be able to explain stuff to VCs where it's not their day job.
Exactly.
It's the same argument actually Etsy has for why you need the Gs.
Right.
Rather than just having a release after release.
Yeah.
Which might, from a technical perspective, make more sense in a way, because and this is why people say, it's a bit underwhelming. It's you're actually going from one release to another, and then all of a sudden the generation changes. But if you talk to Etsy's, like Adrian Scrace, who's the CTO, says, well, we kind of need the whole concept of the Gs actually for marketing purposes, because it focuses government attention and it brings investment in.
And investment, it's all about money.
Yeah, so it's kind of, it might seem a bit sinful in a way to some, because it's hype, but on the other hand, you know.
No, as long as we keep ourselves real and we understand what we're trying to achieve, which is deploy
and also
networks.
It allows us to poke fun at it.
Well, exactly.
Exactly. And you guys have something to make fun about.
Everyone's got their role in the hype ecosystem, and ours is to take the piss out of it.
Awesome. Blockchain. why people should care about it. Blockchain is another technology, right? Same as, we just talk about AI, or we talk about networks, 5G, whatever. Blockchain is a technology that solves a problem. And it solves a problem of creating a trustless environment where we can transact without having to trust each other, because that trust is being placed on a distributed ledger. And it handles things like that by using consensus algorithms. And the way that we use it in our network is creating that governance, right? If we are creating this marketplace of assets, we just need to make sure that if you are contributing to the network with X amount of small cells capacity or whatever, that there is proof that you're actually doing that. And if I'm consuming from there, that there is proof that I am actually consuming that, and that we both meet.
And it's all just there. See, that's where the concept of trustless is really interesting to me. Initially, it sounds a bit sort of pejorative. It's like, oh, why is there no trust in the world? But what trustless really means is there's no need for trust.
Exactly.
It's all just dealt with.
Exactly.
And you were talking, I've never heard the term consensus algorithms before, but I thought that was, which shows my ignorance on this subject matter. But I think not really understanding the cleverness that underpins blockchain. I've tried to. But I do understand. I am a big fan of the concept of decentralization. I'm a big fan of the concept of empowering the individual. I'm a big fan of the concept of not having too much central control of power and influence and all that sort of thing. I don't know how many times you've listened to the podcast, but the amount of times I've banged on about things like AWS cutting off Parler or just
SAP cutting off Russia.
SAP cutting off, and we'll get onto that. We'll get onto that.
That is the main problem with centralization.
Yeah.
Right?
And so I'm a really big fan of, and so that's what I basically take away from blockchain. And this leads on to things like Web3 and metaverse. Is it's a way of things just sort of taking care of themselves without there needing to be a command and control center that sort of controls everything, at which point you have a concentration of power that can be abused or at least manipulated.
Exactly.
And I guess I don't need to know how it works. It just does work. And is it proven? Can we completely trust it? Because you hear about like Bitcoin and these currencies that are incredibly volatile, and I haven't got anywhere near them. I do a tiny bit of investing, and I'm shit enough at just buying normal equities. I'm not getting into cryptocurrency because I just don't understand it.
You should. It's a fun
place. It's fun. Yeah. This one way of putting it. It depends when you buy, though, how fun it is, isn't it? But you talk about trustless. Is this a technology that's now so mature that we really can trust the blockchain for these things to happen as advertised? No one's going to get ripped off. It's quite sort of secure from sort of hackers and bad actors and all that sort of thing.
So if we actually look at the Bitcoin network, it is the very best example of what a blockchain network can do. It actually cut out the banking industry and said, hey, bank,
which I approve of.
You're no longer needed. We can transact
There was
freely.
another one, Visa and MasterCard cutting off Russia. That's even bigger than SAP as far as I'm concerned. I mean, how can you have the two, so much power for electronic payment processing in the hands of two companies that can just turn the switch off any time?
Well, but that's the same that happens within the telecoms industry, right? When we have all of these equipment vendors that control the communications of the entire planet. And the point that, the internet is actually managed by 2 or 3 companies in the world, right? So there is a large component that decentralization is needed in order to have that freedom to transact and to evolve and to progress. And I believe that blockchain is where it's going to take us, and it is just a solution to a problem.
Is there a danger that, because, just to look at it from the other perspective, there's arguments for centralizations and there's arguments for decentralization. I mean, one argument against decentralization is that everything can get a bit chaotic and you don't have sometimes it can be good to have a central authority where this cutting the banking system out of currency might sound appealing in one way, but to a lot of people actually sound quite scary. And I think a lot of people have a sense of crypto anyway as something that sort of, it doesn't really, it's off there, it's chaotic, it's very volatile, as Scott was saying. You don't know what's going on with the value of it. It doesn't really apply to ordinary people anyway, actually. And you can't go out and buy a Mars bar with Bitcoin, can you?
But these are two things. One thing is blockchain technology.
Is that how you gauge utility of a currency, whether you can buy a Mars
Well,
bar with it.
crypto is useless, isn't it, to most ordinary
Yeah, I
people?
know.
It has absolutely no use at all, cryptocurrency.
No,
Yes.
not on an everyday
that's
basis.
nothing to do with the decentralisation argument. I agree. Yeah, I've sort of
Yeah,
went
it's
off on a
just still
tangent
it's
there,
still
but-
so nascent that it's not part of the mainstream.
There's still this sort of, sometimes I think it can be good to have a central authority, and
Yes.
people like the idea of having a central
Yeah, and I'm not-
authority for certain
while
things. They like to have a strong regulator that comes along and says, well, if things are getting out of
Totally.
hand, we're the people who step in, and we're democratically accountable, but we have the ability to come along and do something about it. And it sounds like blockchain doesn't have that, and therefore, is that an argument against blockchain? That it.
I can argue that I think that sometimes regulation coming in, it impairs, the evolution of systems, of technologies, of nations sometimes. So I understand that people are scared about it, but sometimes they are scared about it because they don't know the alternative. They are too comfortable with what exists. And in terms of the utility of blockchain and cryptocurrencies in the future, it's early days, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we are talking about a technology that started only 10 years ago, and we need to mature a lot, and that comes back to your point, Scott, about is it secure enough? Is it can we trust it? Well, I think it has evolved a lot, and even from the beginning, the Bitcoin network is something that can be trusted because it is simple
because
and
of the
it
nature
works.
of blockchain.
Exactly, and it's
Yeah.
simple and it works, And then there's a lot of research going on into evolving that and making it, with more transactions per second and be able to accommodate other use cases and applications. But then the way that we see open permissionless networks is that people can collaborate and people can work together and contribute to a larger good. And you never have that one actor that it's going to take over the control of that network.
Yeah.
But you do have small levels of, power in networks, because sometimes, when we talk about staking in the network, I own X amount of tokens in the network, I can stake, so I have voting power. And at the end of the day, it's about voting. It's about giving the individuals or individual organizations or shrinking the level of participation and getting, more consensus.
I like the idea of it in principle. My concern would be, does it work out that way? A decentralized system without a central authority, people are going to worry that there's always going to be somebody there that's able to. I mean, Bitcoin's a classic example where there's always a perception that people like Elon Musk are they're able to pull strings and do something that other people wouldn't be able to do because of his. All he has to do is put a tweet out, and it can affect the value of Bitcoin. Yeah, and then this is something that's not subject to normal regulation, and it's outside the banking system, and. And you start to think it could all seem a bit Wild West, I think, to some people.
It is.
Yeah?
In that sense, on the price and the cryptocurrency price and, these markets going up and down, something that I have no idea about because I don't know anything about cryptocurrency prices.
So you haven't got any Bitcoin yourself?
Bitcoin, no.
No. You've got what, Ethereum, something else?
Sadly, I do have
Right.
to recognize that I have Ethereum.
How's that going?
Well, I mean,
Are you up? Are you
it's
down?
staking. I'm staking on ETH 2.0. I have Cardano, a network that I do support a lot, and I think it's flowing
Right.
into the next generation of blockchain networks. But the point is that we have one world that it's cryptocurrencies, and that it's one world, and then we have the technology that it's blockchain and how we can apply it to solve problems that exists in other industries and supply chain or commercial agreements, trust across.
And that's the stuff you can get your head around. You
Exactly.
can see how that's actually useful.
Exactly, but without I think cryptocurrencies are useful, and there will find a way to
Anything that goes around Visa and MasterCard gets my vote.
As long as you can buy a Mars bar with it in the future, then I'm all for it.
I'm sure you will. I think
all
now
he
if
ever
you go
eats
to
is
El
Mars bars.
Salvador, you can buy a Mars bar with Bitcoin. They adopted this
Brilliant.
national currency.
Oh yeah, they did. Okay, yeah.
They're getting there, aren't they?
They are, and yeah.
Does
Nutters.
that mean only Elon Musk can buy a Mars bar in
El Salvador?
El Salvador?
But there is a point that I think it's really interesting with cryptocurrencies, and it's tokenized economies. I don't think this is going to become the Wild West, because what it's going to happen most likely, or where everyone who works in the crypto industry would like to happen, is that we're going to have economies that are on ecosystems, right? So I would like for the token that we are working on to be the token used in the telecoms industry. And then you have, how is it called, this massive, department store in the US that I can't... No, the one that is owned by one family.
Walmart.
Yeah, Walmart. They want to create their own token as well, right, for their own supply chain management. And the whole point of having a tokenized economy is that you can build your own monetary policy within your system. So CellStack has a monetary policy within it, and it allows people to enter the ecosystem with fiat currency. Everything operates within the ecosystem with that native token, and then you exit with your fiat currency, because at the end of the day, the Cellnex of the world would like to pay their bills in fiat.
Does that create exchange rate sort of anxiety? Like, so you're saying whenever there's a transition from one type of currency to another, there's a possibility that when you exit that transition, the exchange rate will be different than when you entered.
That's why you need monetary policy, and that's why you need to maintain liquidity in the market. And there is where, the markets, secondary markets, and you as for example, in our case, being responsible for that at this moment, then it will become decentralized. So then it's something that the market should.
I think that's where some of the anxiety, like to stick with Ian's Mars bar analogy, what if a Mars bar cost you sort of 40p today and then a quid tomorrow? I mean, that'd be a nightmare, wouldn't it?
What if it costs you 1 Bitcoin?
But that's the point I think Maria was making is, Mars bar may only be available in a certain fiat currency, and then you may be holding something else, but then you're still exposed to this exchange rate tension when you dip in and out.
It would change the price of the Mars bar.
Who would change it? Well, the market. I mean, that's Bitcoin goes all over the shop. No one's dictating that, are they? It's just speculative bubbles, which is quite a good segue actually, because that's what I want to talk about in a sec. But that's the other flip side. I'm generally, spiritually, conceptually, philosophically, totally in favour of these decentralised open markets. But there is one of the reassurances of centralisation, as Ian was saying, is this degree of control, this degree of stability, this degree of trust, to use that word that, I think everyone's learning who bothers to pay attention that people like the Fed in the States or the Chancellor's Exchequer in UK haven't got a fucking clue what they're doing. But at least we feel that there are these institutions that are in charge, and Alan Greenspan, whoever's in charge of the Fed now, knows what they're doing, and Rishi Sunak knows what he's doing. And we sort of have to believe that. Because if we don't believe that, then it's just chaos. This is something that always amuses me, actually. People need to believe that there is structure, that there's hierarchy, and that the grown-ups are in charge. Whereas I've always been quite at peace with the fact that everyone's just winging it. No one knows what the fuck they're doing.
It's true,
They're all just making it up as they go along.
And then we see that it's actually true. So... it is natural in human beings. We want to trust institutions.
But even if they don't get it right, it's the opportunity to intervene, isn't it?
Yes, control.
It's like big tech, for instance, or Standard Oil in the 20th century. There was a regulator that was able to come along and say, hang on, it's all got a bit too... One company's taken advantage of things too much, and it's in the interests of the American people for this to be addressed. And if you don't have that central power, then things start to go wrong.
Wild West, to use American analogy.
Things start to go wrong and in a direction you can't possibly predict, then who sorts it out, basically?
Yeah,
then
totally.
Who's the person who has the authority to come along and say, well, we're going to do something about it if nobody's in charge?
So then it becomes like Maria's seems to be pretty near the cutting edge of the technological side of things, but then it becomes a cultural thing. You can present all these tools and make them available, but then there's this cultural lag with Luddites like me and Ian going, but what about my Mars bar? And you obviously have to take account of that. And I presume you do, even within your setting, you're going to get a massive cultural lag within the telecoms industry, because people are used to... The telecoms industry has got quite a super tanker turning circle, isn't it? You don't get the impression... We've spoken on the podcast recently, we've gone to events with people like Vodafone where they're all going like, we're going from being a telco to a tech co. And I was just reminded of a story that Andrew wrote on Telecoms.com this week about Telefonica saying it's immersed itself in Web3 and the metaverse, which again is what I'm going to move on to in a sec. But they're doing this telco to tech co thing. And they all talk about DevOps and agility. And yeah, it's just become a cliche already. But I think what they're trying to do by banging on about it so much is they're trying to accelerate this cultural change. It's all very well them buying into technologies and clever stuff like you're doing. But if most of the companies a bit like, nah, man, I'm not ready for that, then it's not going to get anywhere, is it? They've got to get cultural buy-in.
But I think we're very lucky in a sense that the industry is pushing really hard for it. Cultural change.
Yeah,
so
true.
At the end of the day, the technology that it's going to solve the biggest headaches is the one that it's going to win. And for all of us, we just need to make it very easy for whoever is the consumer of that technology to just adopt it and solve a problem that exists in their industry. And for us, with CellStack and the network, is just trying to solve a problem within the telecoms industry without getting into any of the elements of the bigger picture of what cryptocurrencies can do. At the end of the day, in nationwide or in the DeFi space, right? For us, it's just about solving a supply chain problem in the telecoms industry. How does everyone come together and how do we transact with telecoms assets? If we can crack that problem, I think we can solve a problem on infrastructure investment, on how people access telecoms infrastructure, and how do we actually sell connectivity services easier and faster.
Yeah, for sure. I think the big, this is nothing to do with Weaver Labs or anything, but the big picture thing, what you were saying with Telefonica. I mean, the strange thing about telecom is that they all start chasing the same thing, don't they? This is the sad thing, I think, about the industry, really. When you're talking about innovation and invention, it's not just Telefonica. I mean, Vodafone you mentioned, Telefonica, BT's also been talking about being a tech co.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same with the towers thing. I remember it was a few years ago, people started talking about, let's sell our towers.
Yeah.
And then you had this idea about the emergence of tower cos, which had already sort of taken root in the States. I think it's a much older thing there. And then all of a sudden, everybody now is selling their towers, and they're all talking about setting up tower subsidiaries, and that market is becoming. We're now starting to talk about things like the emergence of tower companies in Europe that are too powerful almost. I think there was even a regulatory investigation into Cellnex's acquisition in the UK. And it's the same with this sort of techco thing. If they all become techcos, then it's going to be much harder for any of them to succeed, isn't it? We're talking about how hard it is for Vodafone to hire 6,000, 7,000 software engineers they want over the next 5 years. And presumably then BT's trying to do the same thing if it wants to be a tech co, and Telefonica is going to be trying to do the same thing. And
they should be chucking money at Maria. She obviously knows what she's talking about.
There aren't that many people coming out of universities as software engineers still.
I think there are. It's just that they're not interested in getting into the
not
industry.
interested, and you have to pay them a lot. And if every single telco is looking for them, as well as big tech, as well as the banking sector, as well as startups, then these guys are going to really struggle to transform themselves, I think.
But it's just, I think that, with and I'm going to say something maybe here that it's not very well accepted by the industry, but I think it's just that they always come late into the party, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, why are they becoming tech costs now? Because they understand that software platforms are a much better business than monolithic approach to making networks. Because I can make one software platform and customize it for you, and then I didn't have to spend a dime on customization. And that's what AWS, Google, Facebook did really, really well. And that's the model they're trying to mimic.
Yep.
Well, I think it's a bit too late.
I think you're probably right. I think we can all agree on that. And besides, half the time they're just throwing all their shit at a public cloud giant and going, you sort it out for us, which is almost a sort of admission of defeat in some ways. Anyway, I won't go off on that tangent because that could be a whole podcast by itself.
Yeah.
Before we move it on, we'll do the sort of general current affairs stuff. Keep it quite short and sweet because it's always good when we've got a guest to focus on their core area. Bless you.
What was that noise on the podcast?
Fucking spraying your Rona around the studio. A couple of other buzzwords that overlap with what we've been talking about. Web3. What is that?
Well, Web3 is everything you talked about the good things that blockchain provide, the empowering the individual, looking at privacy preserving, the trustless environment. That's what the new way of the internet thinking is.
And so, how will it change? What will the Web3 internet look like versus presumably the Web 2 internet that we got now?
Well, I think it's because it's based on blockchain. It gives that possibility to the applications that sit on top, and provide, to the businesses that are actually making something out of it, the ability to provide that individual empowerment and privacy preserving. But again, I'm not an expert on Web3,
it's fine.
so that's my interpretation of it.
Yeah. No, I'm not positioning you as the Oracle of Delphi on this stuff, but compared to me, you are.
It's definitely 3.0 though, isn't it?
I don't think it is. No, which I think they missed a trick there, because from what I understand, if you want to be a proper geek, you've got to put a .0 on the end.
Because you're looking at Andrew's article there. What does Telefonica saying about Web3?
I can't remember. There's another buzzword. They're flogging NFTs, which stands for non-fungible tokens.
What are those?
Well, Maria, what's an NFT?
Things that you can sell on the. Actually, what an NFT is a type of smart contract, and it is something that you can. It's unique, and I can sell.
Yeah.
In the blockchain, and then you have it. And it is yours, and then you can.
It's a way of uniquifying something digital, isn't it?
Exactly. So a digital asset, it can be enclosed in that form of
like
smart
for example,
contract.
if they'd had NFTs when the music industry basically died about 20 years ago because everyone was file sharing MP3s. Maybe they could have kept a lid on it and kept making the obscene profits they did.
Well, that's why it has actually taken off so nicely in the arts industry, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
so this story was some bloke drawing what? I mean, you tell me. That just looks like a splat. But
but if you go to the Tate
I'm not an art connoisseur, but I mean, that looks like something my son did when he was about 3.
But if you go to the Tate Modern, you have great pieces of art.
Yeah, well, that's why I don't go to the fucking Tate Modern.
Even
though it's just down the road.
That don't understand art.
No, I don't.
Think these
really
could
don't
be
understand
actually
art.
shown in the Tate Modern, and they could have told us he's like a great artist from the 60s, and we would believe it.
So this thing in Andrew's story has got an NFT attached to it, and obviously, one of the funny things about art. I mean, I don't get it. I'm obviously showing that I really don't get it. I mean, I barely even got like the Sistine Chapel when I went there. I'm that much of an ignoramus. It's like, I was pointing at someone, big deal. But some people do, and some people are prepared to pay a lot of money. And there's a sort of, I think there's a thing that transcends art, and it's just a collector mentality.
The Sistine Chapel's a lot better than that.
I know. That's a
Scott is emotionally challenged.
For anyone watching, I mean, what's that?
Scott's just likened the Sistine Chapel to like a scribble on a bit of paper.
Scribble. It looks like a 3-year-old drawing a sunrise or something. But no, it's the collectible thing, and that's what resonates with me about NFTs. So if you can make something unique, then it becomes collectible. Whereas right now, I've got that picture that we just copied into our story, and that's nothing. I could do that. I don't have to pay anyone unless they've spotted this and they're going to sue us. Wouldn't be the first time. But then I can't say I own it. And it seems that NFTs are a way of creating digital ownership. Is that how you perceive it?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think for the arts industry, it has been a great proof of concept of what it can do. Because you create something unique, you can sell it in the digital world, and you can open that industry to a lot more people than before, right? Because physical art pieces are something that it's not accessible to everyone, and digital art is accessible to everyone, and it's also something that resonates more with the new generations, and it's something that can evolve, make the art industry evolve into something new. But if we grab that, the same as we do with blockchain, we grab that concept and we try to apply it into something else, an NFT can create a digital version of anything. And
we could have a unique version of this podcast, and someone could say, "I own the master copy of the podcast."
Yeah,
I don't think there's a strong market for it.
But if we go back to the telecoms industry, right? All of these assets that we sell, they can be digitized, and they can be transacted, and that ownership can be granted in the form of a smart contract, right? So, and that's the piece that we have in Telecoms.com is the use of NFTs to access public sector assets, all this street furniture that we actually need. And we can create digital versions of a cabinet, a lamppost, a traffic light, and make it very easy to be accessible in an open marketplace to build networks. So it is a great technology and very powerful to reduce frictions when we make business.
Yeah. Well, that leads into the final buzzword that I want to square off before we move it on. You're talking about digital versions of real stuff. We've got the metaverse. And the metaverse seems to be the broader concept where a lot of this digital, virtualized, blockchain-y, NFT type of stuff, where it all exists. And then there's companies like Facebook have obviously bet the farm on it, even with their rebrand.
You mean
Meta? Exactly. God, we had a funny one we were writing about. Have you ever heard of an operator called Etisalat or Etisalat or whatever?
Yeah.
Well,
They've
they've rebranded now
rebranded,
to E ampersand.
E ampersand.
Yeah.
Like ampersand.
Yeah, like the abbreviation for and. And the purpose, if you look at their, those like branding videos are always really nauseating. Like, we believe the world should be a better place and all that kind of crap they come out with. They're basically saying Etisalat and.
Is this a story that came out this morning?
Yeah,
April
Mary
1st?
wrote it up yesterday for us. But anyway, this is a complete tangent. But like, you think Meta's a wanky rebrand? I mean, is what they've done, and you don't even know how to pronounce it. I just don't understand what goes on in the heads of these people.
People didn't know how to pronounce E at the beginning.
Yeah.
E.
I mean, yeah, how do you pronounce it? It's like the artist formerly known as Prince when he had that unisex toilet rebrand or whatever his symbol was. Anyway, I digress. Metaverse. So yeah, it's meant to be a really big deal. One of the biggest tech companies in the world has conspicuously said this is what we're all about. But do you think, Maria, it's a bit overhyped at this stage?
Yes. 100%.
Good answer.
Yeah, I think so. But again,
I mean, will it one day not be overhyped? Will the reality catch up with the hype eventually?
Okay, so how long have we been talking about VR? And
it's still bollocks.
And interacting in the virtual world. We now have a name for it.
Which is basically what it is.
We have a name for it. We now call it the metaverse, and it's a place where everyone can have digital interactions, and it's you have your digital art and your avatars and all that good stuff, and the VR headset and all that stuff. 2017, when you wrote that amicable piece about us, you were walking around Mobile World Congress, or you could see were VR headsets and interactions in the virtual world and gaming and all sorts of good applications for education.
I was in the press. I don't think this was. I think this might have been CES, but I was at a press conference, Facebook press conference, when they were banging on about Oculus, and where Mark Zuckerberg actually walked through the crowd.
That was Mobile World Congress opening.
It was Mobile World Congress.
Yeah, opening of 2017. Actually.
Okay, well that was the same one then.
Yeah.
And I was there. And of course, everyone had their VR headset, so they couldn't see the
Was
great
it just
Zuck.
an avatar of Mark Zuckerberg?
No, it was actually him,
The one he
which has made
created
it
for
more
Meta.
remarkable because he's like some Tasmanian devil he's never seen in the wild.
He was there on stage, I remember.
And he
when
sort of
He was, yeah.
did his little data walk down the aisle while everyone had their VR headsets on. Yeah, with his robot haircut. And
Lasered.
but that's to your point. That was 2017 as well.
Yeah.
And here we are 5 years later.
And we have a name for it.
Yeah.
And something that I do, I expect it to come is that, well, maybe now we are able to actually find a business case for it. Because we haven't so far, right? VR hasn't found its actual business case. It hasn't really, taken off because... Well, gaming, people like to game with their PCs, and eventually that was the case, and everyone said, okay, I'm really happy to continue playing with my PC. So there was no real application for the VR. So maybe now, with all this concept of the metaverse and so much money flowing from institutional investment into startups, we can actually crack it and find an actual business case. But it happens with all the hypes, right? And we need the hype, so that then we get to the actual innovation that it's happening in that industry. And I think that...
Yes, because without the hype, there isn't the interest and the money.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. But I still think... Sorry, I'll just say one thing quickly and I'll hand it over to you. I still think, and we've made this point loads of times on the pod, like Pierre months ago showed us this video of some bloke with a VR headset on, and then he got so immersed in it that he basically smashed into his telly.
He ran into it, didn't he? So he butted it. It was
But-
like something
Can
off
happen.
off a sort of Johnny English film.
Yeah, I know. He just rugby tackled his telly head first.
If you ever play to that game that you have to do like this with the Oculus, it can happen.
Yeah, well,
I'm telling
totally.
you,
I don't know
it can.
what was going on. Maybe he's playing virtual rugby or something. That's the
No,
way
he was trying to skydive.
he's trying to skydive.
Yeah, and then he just
He
went
just
straight to his, like
was overcommitted.
200-inch TV. Yeah.
Anyway, but that's the point. We've said this loads of times on the pod. VR, as opposed to AR, you are constrained by the fact that you can't exist in the real world while you've got a total immersion headset on, can you? So I just think
No,
that's
you'd have to
always
be in a room on your own little.
no. You've got to be in a
travelator.
padded cell.
Yeah.
Actually, in the Oculus, when you first tee it up, you have to draw an area, a safe area.
Right.
So
Well, and
that-
then it goes danger if you venture beyond
and
it.
Basically, it turns on the camera as soon as you get out, so you can see where you're going.
Oh, that's clever. Yeah, that's a
It
solution.
looks like an infrared camera. It's
That's
not
a
a great
solution. It's
camera.
not much help if you're halfway towards diving at the telly
But I've seen-
when
I've
the
seen-
camera switches
Or
on.
you're
Some
safe
people are like,
area.
no! Literally using sort of multi-directional travelator things
Yeah, that's
as well.
next level. Yeah.
That's next level up. Yeah.
Anyway, my point is that the physical use cases of it are limited by that. You can't just. It wouldn't be like having a heads-up display on these glasses where I could imagine integrating that into my real life. I can't imagine integrating VR into my real life. They're two separate things. There's us chatting, there's us going to the pub after, and then there's VR, which is just at
Absolutely.
home by myself.
Yeah, but I think there are a lot of people interested in that. And, now with COVID and a lot of people just deciding that they want to just have a lone life at home, it might be the
Yeah.
case
Yeah.
that the metaverse is the place
I
that
think
they
it's.
want to
I
meet
think it's
people.
monetizable. I mean, I know. You like you say, it's harder to do, and you'd need these quite sophisticated equipment maybe in your home to sort of take full advantage of it. But who knows? That might become.
Oh, my
much
kids are
cheaper in
mad
the
about
future.
VR when they go with
I
their
mean,
cousin.
it doesn't sound like my kind of thing, but I'm a middle-aged man, so and I find the thought of it quite. I suppose it depends how far it goes. Some of these sort of science fiction movie scenarios make it all sound quite worrying, really, that people sort of get lost in
Ready
that kind
Player
of
One,
world.
that sort of
But I think it's. I can see why people would want to do it in the same way that people want to do Fortnite, because if it works really well. It's my limited experience of using a VR headset, which was an Oculus one at a Facebook press conference years ago. It's quite impressive if you're
It is, yes.
and therefore if it gets a lot better, then I can see that people will be interested in paying for that. The thing I find a bit weird about it at the moment is that everybody's it's just like we were talking about with towercos and being a tech co, is this whole. I mean, what the hell has Telefonica got that it can contribute to the metaverse?
Well, the connectivity.
I've read
there
Andy's
is
story a few
important.
times.
the
I'm
metaverse
still
is a bad
struggling.
thing for operators. It's not a good thing for operators.
Because it's
And this is-
indoor.
no, because it's just the amount of, and I talk to people about this at Mobile World Congress, the amount of data that you need to consume on networks to make this sort of stuff work is potentially huge. And they're already complaining about, the way they make money these days is, well, they don't. They're at the absolute limit. Everything's flat rate gigabytes now. It's all gone that way, and yet they have huge pressure on the networks and on a cost side, and they're having to invest in 5G. They're having to invest in new technology, but they're not making any more money from them. And then you've got something like the metaverse coming along, and people talking about Facebook itself saying there isn't enough investment in edge facilities to support this. There isn't enough, the networks aren't quite good enough. I mean, that is the last thing any operator will want to hear. And that's exactly why all of a sudden they started making a fuss about things like net neutrality again. We need metaverse companies to stump up some of the investment that's required if this is going to be used on networks. So I find it weird that people like Telefonica are, and it's actually Telefonica is the outstanding example. I don't remember seeing other operators at MWC making such a big deal of it, and yet Telefonica, I think, had metaverse sort of emblazoned on their stand. The question for them is, how the hell is the metaverse a good thing for you?
Well, here we are. I'll leave it. By the way, before I move on, if people who are watching it are thinking Ian looks extra cool this week, that's actually my shirt he's wearing because he's a bit cold, so I let him my shirt. Last time I let him out my clothing, I didn't see it for about half a year, but I'm going to make sure I get it.
You can
off
rip
him.
this off me as soon as we've done with the.
Fucking bet your life on it, son. Anyway, I'm going to leave the last word. Telefonica has, believe it or not, a chief metaverse officer.
I mean, really?
Yeah, called.
CMO.
I'm gonna
He's not
guess
called
it's a woman.
Kemi.
I can guess it's a woman. Maybe Maria could correct me if she'd be better attuned to Hispanic names. Yaiza Rubio. Yaiza sounds like a girl's name, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, Yaiza Rubio, who's Chief Metaverse Officer at Telefonica, said this. This was the canned quote in Andrew's story. "We're delighted to join Ferran Adrià, who's the person who drew that splat that I was showing earlier."
Ah,
It's
it's
a
El
very
Bulli guy.
famous chef.
El Bulli.
Yeah, he's a chef. Well,
Yeah.
apparently he can draw as well.
He drew that thing.
And just because he can,
It's actually soy sauce.
just because he can whip together a bit of tapas, we're supposed to give a toss about his art. But there we go. And
No,
then
he's a
Ferran
legend.
Adrià, everyone else has heard of him. I've never heard of him, but no, I know it's you've heard of the restaurant. It's one like a
El
top
Bulli.
Michelin
El
star.
Bulli, yeah.
Is it still open though?
I
No.
don't think so, no.
But maybe that's it.
That's what he's doing now. He's doing
His restaurant's
artwork.
shut down. He's like, fuck it,
He
I'll
had
give
a
art a
great
go.
exhibition here. I went to see an exhibition about him or El Bulli, whatever. It was great. It was in London, and there was some art. And I'm remembering maybe he.
Well,
made
there we
some
go.
of it, yeah.
So he certainly dabbles, and he's certainly Telefonica's
He
bought into
sprays
him.
mayo and ketchup on.
Exactly. I call this one spillage. We're delighted to join Ferran Adrià in the first collection of NFTs from his personal drawing collection. Telefonica is committed to continue exploring use cases in the new technologies associated with NFTs, blockchain, Web3 and the metaverse. They're getting all of them. That's four. Four for the
Deary
price
me.
of one there. That represent an enormous business opportunity for different industries and sectors. So that's a really...
Yeah, but not us.
That's a really vague sort of top line. Yeah, we're into this because someone told us it's a good idea. That's what it sounds
Facebook
like
said
to
it
me.
was good a few months ago, therefore it must be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, but as you said, they sit in a completely different part of the stack.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as much as I think that the telecoms industry has, something to do with all this, digital interaction or whatever, it's definitely not something good because it's definitely going to stress the network. And looking at how this can be solved from an infrastructure investment problem,
Might be
it's
where you come in again.
it's where they have to be looking at and maybe like investing in
Unless their
cheap-
business models change.
Definitely,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's why I think the metaverse opportunity now, it's going to give the industry to see how we're going to solve these problems for the consumer market because
Yeah. So
they
we
exist.
while we still reserve the right to take the piss, we're also it's here to stay, and it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. Okay, I'm going to move on because we've been banging on for at least an hour, and we haven't got much time left. We've got a couple of newsy items. I'm going to throw the ball at Ian.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to start with the. You've written two stories. The reason I'm going to start with the Russia one is because the China one is a more obvious segue into our final segment about Huawei.
Oh, okay.
So that's the only reason I'm doing it that way. You wrote a story with the headline "Nokia shows why Russia is a bog for Western tech firms," and I think you've had quite a lot of editorial focus on the effect of the sanctions on our industry and what it means and how doable they are. And we've certainly chatted about it on one or two pods before. But why don't you just give us a top line of what that story was about?
Yeah, well, I spoke to them actually. In fact, you were in the office when I did the headline.
Right? Yes. You referred to me as just your anonymous colleague.
Well,
I was
he didn't know who you
shouting
were.
questions at you from halfway
you
across
had
the
a few
room.
beers by then.
We'd had a couple. So had he, by the way.
And that was. Can you? Is this? Yeah. All right. So I'm fiddling around.
He
the
hasn't picked it.
microphone
We're
and Pierre's
paranoid that it's going to
looking
pack
at
in.
me. No, I think Nokia and Ericsson were quite quick after the whole sort of war started in Ukraine to say we're suspending work in Russia and we're halting deliveries.
Because they
But
don't want to piss off the Yanks.
it's not like, I mean, the point of the article is partly why it's so hard for tech companies to do that in a way that, I mean, the reason they're doing it is partly because they're subject to sanctions, yeah? So technologies that they rely on that have, that are US origin technologies, I think it might be called, they would be in breach of US sanctions if they carried on sort of selling that gear to Russian customers.
Yes, which is the horrible sort of interconnectedness of it all.
Yeah.
And we've covered this lots of times talking specifically about Huawei sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
America is the dominant commercial force in the world. And
Yeah.
so, of course, you're going to get Yank stuff in fucking everything, aren't you?
Yeah, you are. And arguably, there's less of a reputational worry for them because they're not really a consumer-facing brand anymore.
Yeah.
So when, I think I mentioned
like
Starbucks
McDonald's.
in there a few times and McDonald's, but those companies were, they were McDonald's didn't do it very quickly. They sort of fucked around for a bit, I think, and then eventually realised that if they didn't close stores in Russia, there's probably a likelihood that they'd face some kind of boycott in Western markets where they make more money. I mean, I don't know what they make in Russia, but I imagine it's something like 2 or 3% of revenues or something at most. Which is actually what it is for Nokia. Interestingly, it's 2%.
Which could well be Russia's contribution to global GDP or whatever.
If you're selling coffee or burgers and you close your stores and your staff aren't working anymore, then that's pretty much it.
Yeah. And you can always dial it up when the dust settles.
No one's still using your products. They're not still in widespread use across Russia because the coffee's gone cold if you haven't drunk it, and the burger's worked its way through your system. but Ericsson and Nokia obviously are still in. They're still widely used throughout Russia. They still have customers depending on their base stations. They still have their software.
They can't just come round and start nicking their radios off masts, going, "No, naughty Russia, you're not allowed any more radios."
Exactly. And then there was this big New York Times article, which that refers to a fair bit, and I think it links to it, where they'd done some digging and worked out that Nokia's, the whole premise of the article was, they've stopped deliveries, but they're actually still, there's nothing they can do about the software and the networks they've already sold. And those have all been linked to this state surveillance system that Putin and his cronies operate called SORM. Nokia was obviously really upset by this, put out a statement saying we've got nothing to do with SORM, we don't make SORM equipment. I mean, they were both kind of right.
And they used that standard FUD of talking about things being misleading, which is a way of denying something without denying something.
It wasn't misleading because the New York Times didn't say they sold SORM equipment. They said basically that they did lawful intercept with SORM, and Nokia's own statement said we do that. They have to do it. But then it raises questions about, there's lots of dodgy markets in the world, not dodgy markets, but countries with dodgy regimes. Where these companies
that are certainly
operate.
deemed by the West to be dodgy.
Saudi Arabia, for instance. I think only last month Nokia was crowing about this deal it had done with one of the big Saudi companies. This is a country whose crown prince ordered the torture, murder, and dismemberment of a Washington Post columnist not that long ago.
Jamal Khashoggi.
And so it starts to get quite complicated.
Which us journalists tend to take a bit personally. Yeah, I don't want some fucker chopping me up just because I write a story.
And then they're clearly still active.
Touche, Pierre.
I mean, this is kind of links to the other article I wrote this week as well to some extent, but they're clearly still very active in China. They don't have as big a role, obviously, there as Huawei or ZTE. It's a very small percentage of the market that Nokia and Ericsson have, but they still sell equipment, software products, and optical networks in the case of Nokia to China, which is deemed by a lot of US hawks these days as the big threat to Western security, more so than Russia even, and has probably become a bigger concern since the Russia conflict because it's perceived to be sort of in cahoots with Russia and overly friendly and still sort of supplying stuff to them when everybody else has gone, no, it's not acceptable to do.
Yes.
So it just raises this very complex conversation, I think, about where it's acceptable to operate and where it's not acceptable to operate.
And the guilt by association thing, you get this sort of Kevin Bacon 7 degrees of separation. If you sell something to someone who sells something to someone, so on, that has a link to it, are you still in the shit?
And the other awkward thing for them, I think, is, and this comes on to the whole software issue. SAP, which I think I mentioned earlier in the podcast, is
and we got that great.
They tried to be extremely principled about all of this as soon as it happened, and when we're not doing anything in Russia anymore. It's all over. And then their statement got amended like a day later to say, obviously we'll still honour contracts and carry on working for people that we've got deals with. And then I think a few days after that, Ukraine's deputy prime minister, who likes to go on Twitter and sort of name and shame tech companies, put that picture up of SAP's logo sort of.
We spoke about that last week with
dripping
blood
at the bottom because they were still serving contracts, but SAP would obviously be worried about.
Which is so hysterical.
They would obviously be worried about being in breach of contract and running into problems in the future.
And like SAP, imagery like that implies SAP's going around killing people.
Well, then it went back to SAP. It was only last week actually. SAP came out with this other statement where they said they're basically shutting down their entire cloud business in Russia. Which means, and we talk about the disadvantages of using the cloud all the time, right? Well, what are the drawbacks of using the cloud?
Public cloud.
Right. If you get your SAP system on a cloud basis and you're a Russian customer, it doesn't work anymore. And they actually said in their statement, there's nothing we can do about customers that have bought it and are running it on their own premises. I mean, you can imagine that all IT people in companies around the world are all of a sudden thinking, hang on a minute. Is this cloud thing such a good idea now? I mean, they're not everybody's Russia, not everybody's at war, but one company was just able to go, we're switching off our cloud business in Russia, and all their customers are basically immediately screwed. And you mentioned the example of Parler earlier with Amazon,
which is a public cloud thing.
Yeah, and then the other problem I think that
AWS, I don't know how many clients AWS has in Russia, but presumably they can flick the switch on a lot of them.
Well, they say they don't have data centers in Russia. I think AWS. I can't remember.
No, but they still might have clients. They still might have people who use their public cloud infrastructure, their services.
And then the other, I suppose, the other issue for Nokia and Ericsson is it's not clear what they're doing on that front. Are they supporting customers that have bought stuff from? If something goes wrong with your software, and you're a Nokia customer and something goes wrong with the radio software, let's say you're Vion or MTS, and you phone up Nokia and say we've got a problem, do they go and help you at the moment? And I asked Federico Guillen, his name, he's the head of fixed, so he wouldn't be sort of the person on the mobile side anyway, but let's say it's a fixed line problem.
Who you chatting to?
And he said we do what is allowed by the sanctions. But we don't breach the sanctions, which isn't really, it's kind of not really answering the question. So they still have 800 employees in Russia. They're not on furlough, so they're doing something.
Right.
Now, if they're involved, some of them are involved in R&D, some of them are involved in software. If you work for a Western company and you're buying software products and network products from a vendor that uses software staff in Russia at the moment, let's say you're the cybersecurity expert at that company, you're advising your boss, does that seem like a sensible thing to do?
I've got an angle on this for you, Maria. I mean, if you've got any thoughts straight up, then feel free to say them. But we're talking about decentralized stuff. We're talking about these open marketplaces. And we're in a geopolitical climate now where the US and its allies, when they're pissed off with a country, throw their weight around and have all these sanctions. And I'm not anti it necessarily. Russia's clearly the baddie in this situation, as far as I'm concerned. But I think the rest of the world, including people who are geopolitical rivals to the USA, principally China, but perhaps also sort of Indian subcontinent and that sort of thing, are looking at this and thinking, well, these Yanks, they're kind of taking the piss. As soon as they're pissed off with someone, they just flick off the switch via this, I think, excessive symbiosis between government and private enterprise. Because the government can only do so much, but they lean on private enterprise, they lean on tech giants, they lean on whoever. And then knock-on even affects sort of non-US companies like SAP or Nokia that we were just describing. I'm just wondering, from your point of view, there's a little cliche that you might be aware of on Twitter. Something happens that involves centralization, and someone will always put on the thread, Bitcoin fixes this. Have you ever seen that? Yeah. And I'm just wondering to what extent you think decentralization, blockchain, the kind of stuff that we've spent an hour chatting about fixes this. If things were further down the line, would America and its allies be able to impose these kind of sanctions, or would things be so decentralized that they just couldn't do it anymore?
I just think that that definitely can happen, right? If you break something into little pieces, then it is difficult to control it, right? Because it's broken into very, very little pieces. But I think the problem here goes into big tech and globalization, and the fact that SAP has contracts worldwide, and AWS provides cloud services to almost every business in the planet, and there is a responsibility that comes with it, right? And also, like, we choose to use big tech companies every day, but we
trust them to go back to that thing.
and rightfully so. Do we? Should we?
Not if you're Parley, you shouldn't.
But then the US tried to break big tech companies. The Democrats tried a few years ago, and it was challenged, right? Because it's why, but there is a risk of monopoly worldwide that it's happening here, right? So if we go back to the first set of sanctions that were placed against Huawei in this case was, and if we read the NCSC white paper, it says there is a cybersecurity risk because of national dependency upon one single supplier. and one supplier taking control of your entire communications network in the country. That is valid for Huawei, and that is valid for AWS, and that is valid for everyone. And I think
we trust Americans, and we don't trust Chinese people.
Yeah, but that is where the geopolitics come into the picture. I fundamentally agree with what NCSC is saying in terms of reduce national dependency, allow the market
Plurality.
to be as fragmented as possible, so that we don't encounter ourselves in this position. So, yes, to your point, if we allow, not even decentralization, if we allow the market to be so fragmented, then no one has the power to go and say, bye-bye.
Exactly.
But markets, and it's not just, I mean, it's bigger than telecom, isn't it? That whole issue. Like, there's only 2 companies in the world that make aeroplanes,
exactly.
there's only 3 companies that make chips. Yeah, in terms of foundries, I mean, it's like markets tend to end up being very concentrated because you get the network effects, you get the economies of scale, you get the way economics works is it tends to drive, when in a mass market, it tends to drive the consolidation that produces those outcomes, and therefore I think it's getting the balance right is a tough thing, isn't it? Because you obviously don't want monopolies. We talked about this loads of times on the pod. You don't want monopolies, but you probably don't want a market where there's 200 companies and you don't have, and everything's,
and that would never happen for the reasons you say. It's always going to consolidate.
In the same way that it's not efficient for India to have had 15 telecom operators in the past, when they had companies that weren't sustainable, and they were, it was chaotic, wasn't it, sort of 20 years ago or whatever. They've gone from one extreme to the other. Now they've got like 2 or something ridiculous. It's
mainly geo.
It's mainly geo, but yeah, the thing for me with what's going on with you mentioned SAP, I just find it, I can see why they've done it, and I think, and to a great extent, I think the sanctions are really good, the economic sanctions, because
they were necessary.
It's the only thing we can really do,
short of sending a lad,
short of actually getting militarily involved.
Absolutely, no one wants that.
But then again, you think about it from the perspective of the trouble for me sometimes with sanctions is they tend to hurt the wrong people. They're like sort of malfunctioning missiles. They don't hit the intended target. Putin and his cronies will probably be the last people to suffer out of all of this.
The idea is to put pressure on society, so that society puts pressure on him.
But maybe that doesn't happen, because there's been countries where sanctions have been in place for years, where it's just kind of gone on. And like Zimbabwe, for instance, Mugabe was there for a long, long time until he was in his 90s and died, I think.
Yeah.
And yet Zimbabwe was sanctioned.
It's
not maybe a good comparison, because it's not a country that was sort of maybe economically attached to the rest of the world.
It's very hard to get rid of despots.
Yeah, and I think if you're an SAP customer,
is turned out to be bollocks as well.
Yeah, but if you're an SAP customer who was using its cloud software, and all of a sudden you can't, and let's say maybe you're the most ethical company in the world, and maybe you're even a charity organisation in Russia or something. I don't know what you might be doing, but you've suddenly been cut off and hurt in a way. It's like this, totally changing the subject from tech, but I sort of take an interest in tennis, and there's 2 tennis players at the moment who are in the top 10 in the world who are Russian, and there's a big debate about whether they should be allowed to compete. A lot of sports have actually cut Russian teams out because they play at a sort of country level, and therefore Russia can't compete. But tennis is more of a sort of individual thing, and even though you kind of represent your country, you're really sort of playing for yourself. But there's this big debate about whether Medvedev and Rublev should be allowed to turn up to tournaments. And it's even gone to the extent now where I think one of the guys involved in organising Wimbledon, one of the members of the AELTC has said, unless Medvedev comes out and condemns Putin, we're not going to allow him to compete at Wimbledon this year. And it's sort of...
Meanwhile, he's got family in Russia.
Well, that's the other thing. How's he going to condemn Putin when he's probably got family in Russia? I mean... it's not an easy thing for him to be able to do whatever his position is on it.
That'd be like if Uruguay screwed up and someone say Maria couldn't come on this pod unless she says she hates Uruguay. It's just such crude bollocks.
It all starts to get quite messy and complicated, and then you start to think, well, if we're treating Russia this way, then why is it okay for companies still to be active in China? Why is it still okay for companies to be active in Saudi Arabia? And
yes,
I know they're not on the verge of starting a third world war, perhaps, but there's still very sort of unethical things that go on there. So if we start to make judgments about ethics, it gets to the stage where everything becomes very, very confusing.
It's another argument in favour of decentralisation for me, because it takes the ethical element out of it, because no one's one's being asked to make in a purely absolutely, and I know this is very difficult to achieve, but in an absolutely decentralized environment, there are no ethics. This is like free market fundamentalists are like this. It's just the market is the market.
Yeah.
Supply and demand. The problem is there's never been such thing as a pure market. It's always affected by external forces.
Yeah.
But in the utopia of a pure market, ethics doesn't come into it. It just is what it is. People just buy and sell.
Yeah.
There's no consideration for ethics.
Yeah, and you don't have any powerful agent coming and blocking your account just because they think you're a threat to
Exactly.
Yeah.
to the system.
And if people want to keep buying stuff off a country that the government hates, then they can. And if they don't, if they buy into no, everything Russia is bad, then the market will behave accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated topic, right? Because there is
which we've given ourselves about 5 minutes to chat about.
Exactly.
But there we go.
It's very difficult because how do you handle the verge of a third world war without? It's very complicated.
But just going back to the Nokia article, I think the whole thing was sort of trying to be sympathetic, I think, to Nokia. I wouldn't, and I said, if you're a person
you weren't having a pop.
If you're a person buying products and this is not just Nokia, Netcrack is another organisation that I've written about, which is a software company. You'll be very, very aware of them. I have a huge number of staff in Russia, a huge number of software developers in Russia, and clearly it's a massive issue for them because if they're writing products for an international audience, well, if ever the Russian government is going to try to use, if there's ever this danger of governments slipping nasty products into software, that then gets shipped to an international audience, it's now. I'm not saying it's happening, but if there's ever a risk, it's now. And you can guarantee that, US government customers of Netcracker, who've already expressed concern about this in the past, as I understand, will be even more worried about that now. And yet Netcracker can't just go, well, we're just going to scrap everybody we've got in Russia then, because it would upend their business. So I'm sort of sympathetic to the position they're in. And similarly,
dilemma.
It's less of a concern for Nokia because it's 900, 800 people out of an international workforce of 90,000. I think Federico Guillén was saying we can
1%.
We can shift effort. Possibly these staff are not furloughed, but they're not really doing much, basically, and they're still being paid, but they're just not really. But you'd still be. This is just I think with software, it's a real concern now that products could be getting written and potentially manipulated by security services before. We're in the age of cyber war, aren't we? So
I think if we had more time, I had in mind at the start of the pod to sort of talk about deglobalization. We've touched on it, but I'm not going to go there now because, as Maria says, it's such a massive topic that you could just do a whole pod, in fact, a whole series of pods on just that. So I'm going to move it on. I'm going to quickly just touch on your other story, Ian, that I mentioned earlier, where the headline is despite sanctions, US chip sales to China boomed in 2021, and that sort of caught my eye earlier on this week. And you've done an excellent table.
That's a data story, really.
Yeah, it's a data story, but you've done an excellent table of US companies and the stuff they've sold to China, and you've compared it over the last 5 years, year on year, where you can.
Yeah.
And basically, the long and short of it is that in 2021 they sold more than ever.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of attention on Huawei as the focus of sanctions, but that's I think China itself's becoming a bigger concern now for US opponents.
Yeah, and they keep expanding their what they call entity list, and they're throwing more Chinese companies in there.
I mean, I think the perception of and certainly if they read that story, which they might not, but people like Senator Tom Cotton, who's extremely outspoken about China, and was the guy who was sort of leading calls for sanctions on Huawei. They wrote a letter last year to what's her name, Gina Raimondo, who's the Secretary of Commerce,
right,
saying that a lot of the stuff that had been aimed at China was pretty ineffective. Actually, there were things going on. And I just thought, well, I'll look at what's going on. I mean, it would probably shock them, I would think, because there were 16 companies I looked at then, so it includes people like Intel, Qualcomm, companies that ordinary people would be very familiar with that actually produce chips, as well as the EDA software guys and the people who make fab equipment like Applied Materials and Lam Research, and all of them have seen their sales go up a lot in the last year, especially. So if you look at, you've got the thing open, Scott.
Yeah.
If you consider the revenue line for the total is, I think, so if you add up what these 16 companies made in revenues in 2020, it was about 76 billion. Last year it was 101 billion. That's sales to China.
So it's 33% increase.
With the caveat that sales to China doesn't always mean the end customer's Chinese.
Right.
So for instance, Qualcomm might it's based on where the shipments go. So Qualcomm's end shipments might be to a factory in Guangzhou that's owned by LG, for instance.
Yeah.
But that shows, for one thing, how important China is as a manufacturing and assembly hub still. And in the case of the EDA companies and the fab equipment guys, that's clearly Chinese business, because it's stuff that's being used in China to produce stuff. So it's just
So I think that's really interesting, just because, you know, back to the sort of deglobalization thing we were chatting about. America's been throwing its weight around. I think we all agree that something had to be done to sort of push back on Russia with its military aggression. It's been throwing its weight around with Huawei. Our view has always been, if Huawei is guilty of doing the stuff that it's accused of doing, then it deserves to be sanctioned, but no one's ever really delivered conclusive evidence to that effect. So we'll just continue to treat them as we would Nokia or Ericsson. I'm not going to take the Americans' word for it if they can't even be bothered to deliver the evidence.
It's not actually just American companies. There's a Dutch company called ASML, which is
they're right in the middle of.
Well, ASML is really important. It's one of those.
Process,
it's one of those not very well-known companies. It's actually really, really important, because they make lithography equipment.
That's it.
Which is
UV
basically used for. It's used for etching on the silicon wafers.
Yeah.
So you need really advanced lithography equipment to
Especially
make
as you go down
to make
the
small
manufacturing processes.
And there's two types of product. There's deep ultraviolet lithography, which is older, and there's extreme ultraviolet lithography, which is what you need for the kind of really sort of small nanometer
deep, so
stuff.
passe. I'm all about extreme.
And the Dutch government stopped them from selling EUV equipment to SMIC, which is a Chinese foundry. Last year they were blocked from selling it on security grounds, but they can still sell DUV equipment. So I looked at their sales as well. Their sales to China in 2019 it was 1.4 billion euros. And last year it was 2.7 billion euros. That's a massive increase. I mean, this is the thing, for all these companies, China is a massive growth market, and they're all obviously worried about the possibility of more sanctions. Qualcomm said this in its last filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission, which sort of draws attention to the worry. A significant portion of our business is concentrated in China, and the risks of such concentration are exacerbated by US-China trade and national security tensions. I mean, Qualcomm's sales in China, to China I should say, last year were 22.5 billion, and the year before it was 14 billion.
So well
but
done.
They manufacture almost everything that.
It will be chips for people like the Huawei smartphone business that got sold.
Yeah.
What is it? Honor. It
Yeah.
would be Oppo, Xiaomi, plus other stuff they're doing that's not smartphone based potentially. But
even nothing that no one heard us bang on about last week because of that dodgy bit of kit. Listen,
where it was made.
Yes. Well, I think you can guess. Okay, we've been banging on for ages, but I promised that we'd do one more little Huawei bit that we spoke about. So yeah, we've had to gloss over. I mean, some of these things we could have spoken about in much greater depth, but it was worth it just to hear more from Maria. But yeah, I wrote a headline, and you wrote this up. I don't know what your headline was. I'm sorry, mate, because I'm just self-obsessed and I don't care about anyone else. I wrote a headline that said, somehow Huawei somehow made more profit than ever last year. And the thing was, not only is it counterintuitive that they made loads of profit anyway, given all the shit that they're getting off the Yanks, but their revenue was down 30%. So their revenue is down 30% from
about 100 billion.
From a lot of renminbi to less renminbi. And that's what they put in the annual report. And yet their profit was up about the same amount. From 72 things, 72 things to 121 things.
Yeah.
So
I wish my company is one day like that. Like things.
Precision.
Not about billions, things.
Precision is overrated.
121 billion crypto things.
This is what Martin Sorrell should do.
And their margin was up from 8.1% to 19.1%. In other words, they became enormously more profitable while making 30-odd% less revenue. So how the fuck did they do that? I hear you ask. listener who's still hanging on after an hour and a half.
How do they do that, Scott?
Well, I looked into it in a rare example of me actually looking into something rather than just going, bah, this is what I reckon. It actually, I've got to give Ian credit where it's due, because we were IMing during their fairly long annual report. They did one of these live annual reports. They love it. I don't know if this is a general Chinese cultural thing, but they like to do it all live, and it's in a big fancy ballroom. And it's all quite, it's all quite upper crust. But at the end of the day, they were just talking about numbers. I don't know why they needed to put on such a presentation. So yeah, just looking at it, two things happened. One was cost of sales. So cost of sales in 2020 was 564 things, and this year it was 329 things. So the cost of sales went down by 30 or 40%.
Yeah.
And you could say, well, that's fair enough, Scott, because their actual sales went down. But I did do a quick calculation, and the ratio between sales and cost of sales last year and this year changed quite a lot. In other words, they become a fuck of a lot more efficient if you just look at cost of sales. I don't know precisely what goes into cost of sales, but there was talk at their presentation about efficiency. They brought that up quite a lot, didn't they?
Yeah.
They had Meng Wanzhou, is that how you pronounce her name?
Yeah, it's supposed to be things that you use directly to produce a particular product.
I see.
Yeah.
So it's just immediate overhead rather than paying commission to salespeople. And that sort of
it
thing.
doesn't include things like research and development, for instance.
No. Well, that's a separate item.
Line item underneath that.
Yeah, and that's another thing to bring up. But anyway, their cost of sales went down a lot, and it decoupled from the actual revenue, which I thought was a bit suspicious, if I'm honest. And then the other, and probably much more significant singular item was other income. And you're like, okay, other income. There's a link to note 9 on their annual report, and basically it was gain on disposable subsidiaries and businesses, and the link to that, which is note 34. I tell you, going through annual reports, fucking hell.
Well,
that's where you earn your living, right there. That's why I get the big bucks, Ian. It's going through this stuff. Long and short of it, it was the disposal of Honor that we just touched on earlier, which was their slightly more down-market smartphone brand. And then disposal of a, what do they call it?
Did you notice all the caveats as well about those disposals? Like, they're not really done deals almost. And
really? No, I didn't see that.
Yeah, and we're not really sure if the payments coming, or not in those words, but words that almost sort of seem to mean that. Which I thought was odd that then I think the amount they got was 57 billion things, which works out at $9 billion US dollars.
So they got, like, on their annual report thing, which is in millions. So multiply this by a million. They got 57,000 things.
Yeah, that's $9 billion
in 2021. Whereas last year they only managed 592 things.
Yeah, well, they didn't.
So that's gone up almost 100
in 2020.
Almost 100 times. So anyway, the long and short of it is, we're getting to that sort of I've had a few beers loose end of the podcast. They are only more profitable because primarily they're a bunch of one-off items, disposals. And incidentally, the x86 server thing was sold to, you guessed it, as I put it, a state-owned firm.
Yeah.
So, this is where some of the mud that gets thrown at Huawei does stick. There clearly is, I think, a greater symbiosis between Huawei and the Chinese state than there is even now. And God knows, we were talking earlier about how there's too much coziness between private enterprise and governments in the West, for my liking, especially in the US. But it's still, I think, an order of magnitude greater in China. Whether or not that gives us the right to judge them for it is another matter. Anyway, and so they've got this one-off item, and they've got this suspicious drop of zillions of things in cost of sales. And without those two things, they would have made a loss. So it just felt like... Do you know the funny thing about it? I was pleased because we've moaned about them being really opaque about their numbers in the past. This seems to have been they seem to have been more open than before. They seem to have had a more comprehensive public annual report than before. They had an extensive Q&A. Yeah, they dodged a lot of questions, but at least they had the Q&A on the thing. But I still can't get past the gut feeling that these numbers are a bit cooked. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I just think it's odd that I don't know how accounting works in China, but to book all of that above the operating profit line is weird anyway. And You know, the other thing that I think is interesting is that this massive increase in research and development spending.
That's it.
Not
the highest ever level.
Not a massive increase actually, but still at a
Enough
massive level
to make that claim.
And up on what they were spending last year. I think they're now spending about a fifth of revenues on research and development, and it's about 22 billion. Well, clearly the reason they could do that without their net profit going down was because they got this big sort of other income from these disposals. Now, unless they do that again this year.
Well, that's exactly.
This is the problem. If they hadn't had those disposals, I think I worked out their net profit would have been down 13% or whatever.
Yeah, something like that.
So it would have been a massive drop, and that's obviously a story.
I think they would have made a loss.
That's a story they don't want to. Well, I worked it out. It was down 13%.
Okay, right.
Without the 9 billion.
I'm not going to claim I worked out. It's just my gut feel.
But they still don't want to be reporting drops in net profit clearly, and you know. Would they be able to justify the same kind of amount of spending on research and development if they hadn't been able to do this big divestment?
Yeah.
And can they divest anything else? That's the trouble. Maybe there's other network units that they can sell. I don't know next year. They probably don't want to sell anything in the enterprise side of things because that's supposed to be the growth opportunity for them. You know, that's the software stuff. That's the cloud stuff that they're trying to position as the kind of growth area, which in itself didn't do very well.
Yeah.
It was up 2% after growing like double-digit rate for the last few years. So again, the strategy's sort of failing, this pivot to software. Well, their consumer revenues are down 50%, their carrier revenues are down 7%, and their enterprise business, which is where a lot of the software focus is, was up 2% after growing at double-digit rate. And if you take out the cloud, because Guoping, who's one of the rotating chairmen, actually gave what they make in cloud revenues, which is about 20.1 billion things, as you would say, Scott. And that was up 34%. So if you take that out of enterprise, their enterprise revenues actually fell last year. So all that stuff about software for mines and software for cars obviously isn't. Yeah, so I think
in summary, I think I've always thought, like I wrote from Mobile World Congress this year, I'm all for Huawei doing its best to overcome these extraordinary obstacles that be thrown in its path by the US. But that doesn't mean it gets a pass if it tries an annual report that's got some fairly implausible numbers, or even if the most benign interpretation, which I agree with you, and my final line in my story was, it'll be interesting to see what new rabbits Huawei pulls out of the hat in a year's time, because that's the thing, you can't keep relying on one-off bits and bobs.
Yeah.
Sooner or later it's got to be. I don't know if, Maria, if it's necessarily fair or appropriate to ask you to comment on that. If you have any comment, you don't have to.
I mean, such a big company, right? I would, if there's so much money being put into R&D, I would be very interested in seeing exactly what comes out of that. As an interest, in the community and the ecosystem growing, I'm interested to see what they have to do about it. I do agree with you that, I hope they actually make something out of it, out of the business, even with all the sanctions, because I believe in the industry being rich and having, diverse inputs from everyone. And but in terms of the numbers, I don't think I have anything to say about it, because those are too many things coming up and down.
I know.
And
well, that's part of the fun thing of this format, is we get people on and we talk about their stuff, but the quid pro quo is they've got to be able to talk about other stuff, and which you've done very well, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'll wrap it up there. It's been great having you on, Maria.
Great being here.
Great to meet you face to face.
Yeah.
And you're welcome on any time. So keep in touch.
Yeah.
And and we'll wrap it up there. So thanks a lot for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.